right. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this fireside chat about synthetic intelligence. My name is Hon, and I'll be your moderator for today. So a bit of background about myself. I'm the CEO and founder of Cortical Labs. We build biological computers by hybridizing stem cell-derived neurons into silicon chips. On to my left is Zdenka. Zdenka, do you want to talk a bit about yourself?
Right, thanks Hon. Hi everyone. So my name is Zdenka Kuncic. I'm a physicist. I'm at the University of Sydney, and I guess the reason why I'm on this panel is because we're going to talk about synthetic intelligence, some of which might be biologically based, but what I'm interested in is also synthetic intelligence that might be physically based. So yeah, great. Over to you.
Hi, I'm Anil, Seth. I am a professor of neuroscience at the University of Sussex in the UK, where I also direct the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science. And my research is really about the biological or biophysical basis of consciousness, mainly in humans, but I'm very interested in what can be said about the relationships between consciousness and intelligence in humans and other animals, but also in AI and also in neurotechnologies like organoids.
Sandra?
Hello, I'm Sandra Acosta. I'm professor of neuroanatomy at the medical school at University of Barcelona, and I am leading the lab of brain organoids for neurodevelopmental disorders at the same university.
Excellent. So to kick off the whole discussion, I think it'd be really interesting to find out, from everyone's perspective about the term synthetic versus artificial, because there is a lot of overlap, right, in the way we think about, synthetic intelligence. Is it a subset? Is it a superset of artificial intelligence, given that that is the hot term at the moment? So, anyway, maybe Zdenka, you might have some ideas about the definition of where you think synthetic is coming from versus the whole artificial aspect.
Yeah, so I guess the way that I differentiate between those two terms is that synthetic is something that you make. So if you think of synthetic fibers or synthetic drugs, you make it, there's something physical, tangible there, as opposed to artificial in the context of artificial intelligence, which is really much more abstract. You're just working with algorithms. So that's, at least to me, the way that I differentiate those two terms. Yeah.
Anil, what do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that the term AI has been so co-opted by one particular methodology, which is machine learning algorithms. And it's actually, to me, part of all the confusion about AI comes from that term, which has all its science fiction baggage, compared to something like machine learning or even just applied statistics, which is really what it is. Whereas I suppose synthetic is broader, so it can encompass things that you physically make rather than just implement algorithmically. So you wouldn't be obviously right to use the term AI to describe an organoid playing a video game, even though functionally you might say that's fine if deep minds develop an algorithm to do that. So it's a broader term, and I think it's really interesting because a key question in all this is the extent to which the stuff something is made of matters when it comes to things like consciousness and intelligence.
Very good. Sandra, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I also think very much the same. So I think broader terms, artificial, it's broader than synthetic. So synthetic is something that we produce literally, and artificial, it can go a little bit beyond although it has a big overlap, I think, in most of the cases, and it can become really confusing for people that we have been doing things in the lab. I'm producing things using our intelligence.
Yeah, those are all fascinating points. Actually, I'm going to come back to you, Anil. You talked about, what stuff is made from, and I'm very keen to hear your thoughts about that, given the hard question of consciousness, and maybe you can give an introduction to that to the audience who are not familiar with that area of research.
Well, the hard problem, it's usually called the hard problem of consciousness, has been a way of thinking about consciousness that simultaneously really clarified this challenge, but also made it almost insolvable, and therefore has been both helpful and incredibly unhelpful, I think. It comes from David Chalmers, a philosopher, a friend of mine, very good philosopher. And he puts it like this. He says, why should it be that physical processing gives rise to a rich inner life at all, which consciousness? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. So it's really a modern version of the mind-body problem, of going right back in philosophy to the question of how is it that any kind of physical stuff, whether it's neurons and electrochemical pate inside a skull, or silicon chips and information process, how can any kind of physical stuff give rise to any kind of experience whatsoever? And yeah, a key kind of fault line in this debate is whether something like consciousness is a matter of computation, of information, or whether it's something that fundamentally depends on the properties of the underlying material. You know, when we talk about something like metabolism, it's fairly clear that depends on actual stuff. You know, a simulation of metabolism on a computer will not actually metabolize anything. So I'm a bit of an outlier here. I think many of my colleagues think computation is enough for consciousness. I'm very unconvinced by that. For intelligence, it's a different matter, because intelligence, at least for many things, you can imagine defining it in ways that in principle could be in an algorithm. And if it's an algorithm, then in principle, the substrate doesn't matter. That's kind of what an algorithm means.
A really good point about that. And, you know, I'm keen to hear your thoughts, Zdenka, about, you know, if Anil's talking about the matter and, you know, part of a mind-body problem, we do know, or at least we think that we're at least conscious. So one type of material seems to lend itself to that, which is, you know, the brain and neurons and so forth. But what do you think about your materials, the silver nanowires that you work on?
Yeah, the great question, Hon. Great question. I guess, you know, is there such a thing as synthetic consciousness? You know, well, we're talking about synthetic intelligence. So I think that, you know, it's a really interesting thing to investigate. And if you think about, you know, the word consciousness is such a loaded word, but trying to ground it, for me, means that, okay, if you're trying to emulate consciousness as people experiences, probably the best example is when you think of a small child. And as we probably all know, small children ask a lot of questions because they understand the limit of their knowledge, or the lack of their knowledge. They understand the boundaries of their knowledge. So if we impose that idea on AI or even synthetic intelligence, what that implies to me is that there needs to be some kind of feedback. So an entity that knows the limits of their knowledge needs feedback in order to expand their knowledge. So now, impose that now on ChatGPT. ChatGPT is very one way. It doesn't have any feedback. So next time you go into ChatGPT, it will never come back at you with a question, because it doesn't understand or know the limits of its own knowledge. So that's just one way in which I kind of think about it as a physicist. You know, the idea of having feedback, and feedback is very important, not just for intelligence, but I think probably also with regards to this question around consciousness as well.
Very good. I'm going to hear your thoughts, Sandra, about this. Like, I know we've jumped... This is not what was planned, but we're riffing this, right? Because we've gone straight to consciousness. Yeah. But I'm sure we can always go back and forth between that and intelligence. But
oh no, once we're on consciousness, you will never get off this subject. This is a very bad strategy.
I know. But it is the sexy topic, so we got lured into doing it first. But I'm very keen to hear about your thoughts about the organoid side of things, right? Because there have been journal articles published where these organoids appear to exhibit brainwave patterns that mimic embryonic growth and development. Is there a potential? Is there a chance that maybe some of these might have some elements of consciousness?
Great. Great point. Actually, I'm gonna go a step back and I'm gonna mark that I'm a neuroanatomy professor in the School of Medicine, so my perception, my consciousness about consciousness is very different. So I take it as both consciousness and intelligence are functions that inherent of our human brain, probably in other species, but they are just functions as we can see it. We can track them back to certain connections that we have in the brain that are leading. So on the one hand, we have intelligence. Intelligence is based on our learning, very similar to what we call artificial intelligence, right? That's where it comes from. And it's a predictive method that we have developed as a process of evolution to react to something in our environment, either like our body or in our outer environment. But consciousness is something that have appeared much later in evolution. Animals like a fly, you said in your talk this morning, they are actually intelligent. They can react to their environment, but they might not be completely full conscient in the way we present consciousness. And in the way we present consciousness is about a lot to do with our perception of ourselves. And that goes, as you said, go beyond the biological terms. It goes a lot into what we see philosophical. And it's very related to how we establish our limits, of body limits. No, you put very nicely the example of a kid. I'm not sure as a mom that they are fully conscient. That's I would say, but it's clear that it involves how we see each other with respect to the rest of the world. And that leads me directly to your question. So, for an organoid to be conscient, it has to have sentience of the system. And when I mean sentience, it's something much more evolved in terms of perception that what we have right now, that it's a response, a genetic response or a transcriptional response of the changes that we are inducing, metabolic insults that we put a drug or something like that. So it will involve that processing the information and reacting in a systemic way. And so far, I think organoids are not made for that, and it's not going to be immediate to go to that point. But obviously, it's a debate that we really need to put on the table because they might have the capacity.
Hon, I wanted you to answer your own question. I mean, you work with organoids too, and we've talked about this in other situations. But what do you think, and has what you think changed in the time that you've been developing these technologies?
So I think, I'm going to take a very reductionist point of view here, right? We know for a fact that the human brain has the capacity for consciousness. We primarily at Cortical Labs work with monolayers, so they don't even have most structures involved with organoids, right? So organoids, for most of you don't understand or are not familiar with, are essentially three-dimensional spherical structures made out of neurons. So they have, layers that are a lot more similar to what you would find naturally. But my thinking here is that we don't actually, we're nowhere close to actually consciousness. In fact, we're only just scratching the surface of intelligence with what we have with our monolayers. But that's not to say that there's a spectrum along the way, right? And that if you just keep stacking and growing them large enough, there will be a point where these things will have an emergent property. Because I think that consciousness is an emergent property.
What do you mean by emergence? This is always a very tricky term. Do you mean something magical, or do you mean something like measurable?
So, not magical, but in a sense of a complex system, right? A complex system is hard to track so let me take a step back. A complex system like a single neuron is not particularly very interesting, right? But once you start having groups of them, you get very interesting dynamics, and the larger you get, the more dynamics you get. In fact, Zdenka probably can talk more about this later after me, but the emergence really is just when you get very large and you get dynamical properties that are very hard to predict. because they're somewhat like chaotic systems. So I particularly think that, again, I'm not the expert in consciousness, but I do think that it is an emergent property, particularly on the complexity of the organism and the structures around them. So, for instance, I think the great apes, the primates, our closest of kin, we probably think of them as having consciousness, right? They pass the mirror self-test. They show things like empathy. They care for one another. All the things that we think about.
But isn't that the wrong criterion?
Well,
I mean, that just these things like these. I think those don't they? To me, those reveal our human biases. That we attribute something like consciousness when something is sufficiently like us, which is why we over-attribute to things like language models.
Yes,
and we under-attribute because many animals fail the mirror self-recognition test, which is super interesting. But there's no grounds for withholding consciousness from them. It's maybe grounds from withholding something like self-recognition, but ability to feel pain, no.
100%, and I think there is a bit of anthropomorphization coming from this, right? And from my perspective, I think the reason why I don't really think that LLMs or artificial neural networks are actually conscious is the fact that if you actually run the program, they're actually very linear, right? It's essentially, if you boil it down, f of x equals y. If you don't give it an x, you do not get a y. You do not give the prompt to a language model, you will get no output. On the other hand, we are physical beings that are embodied in the real world, which receive information, we process it, and there's an output. We're never disconnected from information, so to speak, and we are always running some sort of clock or some sort of process. If you think about like a while loop, we have a while loop that's continuously running in a sense. I'm not so sure about if LLMs actually have that while loop that's continuously running and evolving in the form of an online learning process, which I think is really critical for artificial generalized intelligence, which we'll get there a bit later. But I'm keen to hear your thoughts, Zdenka, about that.
Yeah, I guess I've got a lot to say. Firstly, I'll just touch on that topic that you both mentioned, emergence, and as a physicist, that means something very specific to me. So first of all, whenever you have what's known as a many-body system, you have lots of individual elements interacting with each other. It could be a bunch of people talking to each other or whatever. You end up with some collective behaviour. And that's kind of interesting. You get more being the sum of its parts. But also, whenever that system of many elements also is interacting in a dynamic way, and the physical world is a dynamic world, we're interacting with things that are changing all the time, then there are also additional dynamics that produce additional interesting emergent properties. And some of these additional properties that emerge are things like dynamical phase transitions. And they're interesting to study in terms of whether they have additional effects on intelligence capabilities. So I find that aspect kind of interesting. And also I would say that, you were talking about, let's say, large language models and how they're structured and how they operate. They operate in a fundamentally different way from the way in which our brains operate, because our brain, whereas these large language models and other types of AI models, as you mentioned, Hon, you give them an X and they perform a function. And if you have enough of these artificial neurons, they can pretty much approximate any function, really. But what our brains are doing and what other potentially different forms of synthetic intelligence might be doing is something a little bit different. They approximate what are known as ordinary differential equations, so functions that change in time. And that time is where the dynamics comes in. So that's what our brains are really good at doing. And that's what I think real intelligence should be capable of doing. Yeah.
Anil?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that real brains are continuous dynamical systems, chemical machines as much as they are networks of interacting discrete neurons. And when we think about something like a Turing machine, very powerful, but it's actually a limited space in the space of all possible kinds of functions. And whenever you have stochasticity, when you have continuous functions, you are strictly outside what Turing computation is all about. So this just opens the possibility that although you can always approximate any system with a Turing machine, it doesn't mean that your approximations will be exact. In general, they won't be exact, and they may very well not be the most efficient or effective way to do things. And I just rolling back to the intelligence point, it could well be that a lot of what brains do, whether it's consciousness, intelligence, or something else, really does depend on these non-computational functional possibilities. And so organoids are very interesting, or even the monolayers that you work with are extremely interesting, if only for the dynamical functional repertoire that they provide that then can be exploited by other systems. I'm also reminded here of the brilliant work of Mike Levin and his group with so-called xenobots and anthrobots, these cells, not brain cells in this case, but other cells like from the throat or from the frog skin that can do all kinds of amazing things. And it shows to me that biological material have these deep wells of dynamical resource of a very different kind to silicon, which is very good at particular kinds of things, but very different kinds of things that most biological cells, whether the neurons or otherwise, can do.
Sandra, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I'll come back to that. But first, I had a question. So when you said emergent property, as a biologist, probably similar to physicists, we have a complete, very accurate definition. So it's something that appears that was not there, and it happens by itself. So consciousness, it can be seen evolutionary, an emergent property that has happened in certain upon certain point in evolution, in an analog manner even. So maybe we can consider if consciousness is not directly associated to neurons, which is very possible. We might have that plants and fungi and algae even have consciousness as a system happening together, not necessarily through neurons, because they react to their environment. What do you think about that?
So can I respond to that?
Yeah,
I don't. For me, anyway, simple responsiveness to an environment is not sufficient for consciousness. It's very, very easy to instantiate in any system. Very trivial. I think we just don't know what the minimal sufficient conditions for consciousness are. It could, but what we do know is that it's actually surprisingly easy to lose, even for human beings. So if you were to make a guess, it does seem that nervous systems of some kind are necessary, at least for biological systems. When it comes to emergence, I think so I've been working on this a lot, and was talking to Sean Carroll about this yesterday. There's this kind of magic sense it's sometimes used in, that you get enough neurons and abracadabra, consciousness appears. And I think this is a very unhelpful sense. But there are also, in my group, we work a lot on developing mathematical measures which really quantify and operationalize emergence. And one sense is emergence over time, as you said, in evolution, or indeed in human development, from the fetus to an infant to a person. But there's just another, I think, and you were getting at this, a more basic sense in which you can say the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And that doesn't have to be in a mysterious way. Even in a flock of birds, there's a sense in which the flock has a dynamics which seem to follow a law in their own right, and you don't need to understand what the individual birds are doing to know what the flock does. And I think these senses of emergence, which do not contravene any kind of reductionism, there's nothing magic going on, are very powerful tools, because there is a sense in which consciousness is a global unified property that is underpinned by many things, whether they're neurons or other things. So it's a very helpful tool, but I think we always have to be careful to avoid smuggling in some sort of magic dust by another term.
I completely agree with that point. But one thing that I wanted to pick up on, actually, Sandra, you did mention something about analog, right? And most people know I'm a very big fan of analog, and I think the reason for that is if you think about the difference between digital and analog, right? And you take a step back, in a digital system, you have to sample time, and you have to make a decision. How small are my windows going to be, right? Am I going to be doing 1 second sampling, 1 millisecond, 100 milliseconds? All these things, right, matter. And I'm almost very curious to find out if we can actually truly build generalized intelligence or even get to consciousness with digital systems that may not be sampling time. If time, as you were talking about as a dynamical system, is a critical function to consciousness and maybe even in generalized intelligence, do we have the tools with digital systems to actually make that happen? Open to the floor to anyone answer the question. Zdenka, Neil?
I don't think so. I mean, I think time is fundamentally different in these systems, and you basically, I think, made that point, that in digital systems there's a clock. There's asynchronous things, but time is manifest in a very different way. And but I'm still not sure that's the difference that makes a difference. I'm not sure how much continuous time is strictly necessary, but it's certainly a significant difference between biological and synthetic digital stuff.
Sandra?
Yeah, I think, again, like from a biological neuroscientist perspective, obviously time and non-artificial time, as we are putting, so something like seconds and milliseconds and minutes is something that we invent, but the cells and our systems, they have their own clock. And that's vital for how we interpret our environment. So that's intrinsic of our consciousness and our intelligence to respond to those effects that are happening. So yeah, that's part of the system.
Any thoughts from a physicist's point of view, Zdenka? You guys love time and general relativity.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with the sentiment here as well, that time, that's where the dynamics comes from, and I think that's really key, and that's the key point of difference between the artificial and the synthetic. Yeah.
There is, of course, there are analog computers. Some of the early computing paradigms were not digital. They were purely analog systems, and time is in there in a more fundamental way. So I think it's almost an orthogonal dimension. You can have fully manufactured systems made of non-biological stuff, which do computation in a continuous fashion. So that's why I'm not convinced that just simply building in a responsiveness to time in a continuous way is enough to enable things like intelligence and consciousness, but it might help.
So we're getting close to the tail end of this, but I wanted to ask a few questions about, the question of ethics, and it's a broad question again, but is it for you, Anil, life that is required to birth consciousness?
That's what I think is the most likely situation. I don't know it for sure, but I've over the years become much more skeptical of the idea that it's information processing or computation, and more drawn, for various reasons which will exceed our time, think that life is necessary but not sufficient. And so ethically, I think we need to just recognize how much our human psychological biases come in, and realize we may have to bring into our domain of moral consideration things like organoids more quickly than the next iteration of GPT.
Zdenka, I'd like to hear your thoughts, given you are working with physical analog systems that could potentially exhibit all the things that we're talking about, intelligence and consciousness, but do not have that key property of life.
Yeah, it's really such an interesting thought, I actually kind of want to invert that a little bit, because let's just sort of play with the idea, well, what if I found some evidence, according to whatever my definition is, of consciousness in the sorts of tech that I'm developing? Would it necessarily be a bad thing? It's not a living thing. So, the ethical question is kind of a bit different from when you're working with living systems. And what makes it also interesting is thinking about the idea that we could build a synthetic consciousness that could actually provide ethical advice to us. Because one of the flaws of humans is that we are actually very emotional. You know, we make decisions based on our emotion. And so if you could make a device that didn't have any emotion but had consciousness, it might actually provide something useful to us and make decisions for us without any emotional baggage attached to it.
Can I disagree with you completely on both of those points? Firstly, I think ethically and morally, it is consciousness that is fundamental and life is secondary. That's my perspective. But the ability to suffer, to have experience, is, you know, especially from a utilitarian perspective, that is what matters. The fact that something is alive is maybe important, but if it's alive and not able to experience anything, then I think its ethical standing is you know, not so obvious. So I disagree with the first thing. And then I also think, frankly, we should not be trying to outsource our ethical decision-making to other things. I do think we have to take responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in, and it's a very dangerous line to follow, to sort of say, oh yeah, you things that are not us, make the decisions because we know we're flawed. No, I think that's a really bad idea.
Point taken.
Yeah. We agree to disagree on that point. But, you know, what do you think, Sandra, about this from the organoid perspective? And, you know, yes, you are building living systems, albeit in a dish.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Anil here. We shouldn't outsource our consciousness. I absolutely think that will lead to several problems, because what decision you will take based on the observation or forgetting that gut feeling that we get when we take a decision. So that's very much important in our life, and it doesn't need to be specifically emotional. It's simply we might be sensing things from different organs that are not directly our eyes or ears or things. So we are sensing through many other aspects and coordinating our response, integrating it, and that's the function of our brain, of our intelligence is part of it. So outsourcing just based on something that is just seen or just heard might be very limiting when we take decisions. So I'm pretty much skeptic and against using that for sure. Yeah, and I think again the organoids, they might not, because they don't have a body, so they won't be sensing in the same line of what I just said. They won't be sensing everything in the same way that we do, or even an ape would be doing. So yeah, definitely outsourcing is limited for me.
Yes, I think it's going to be a hard one until we ask the organoids, are you having any pain? Are you suffering? And then, you know, what happens after that? I think that is the next frontier. We will need to understand, and I think come up with metrics, right? What is this consciousness? Where is the line? Where do we draw the line? What does the line even look like, right? Is it a straight line? Is it a squiggly line? I think all of these are, you know, the frontiers of you know, the science that we're working at, and, you know, the reason why we're all here at XPANSE. Now, I'm very conscious of time, and I think we have some time for one or two questions. And anyone in the audience with questions over there?
Please explain me shortly, what is the difference between synthetic intelligence and AGI?
So I think it is a very hard way. Nobody really can actually explain it. I'm gonna put it this way, because there is no current consensus of what AGI actually is, and I think that the common joke is that the only thing that we can agree on in the AI community is that we disagree on the term AGI. Some people think it's superintelligence. Some people think, like Jan LeCun, that, you know, it's entities that can build world models and have intuitive physics and so forth. So I don't think the community really has a consensus. But I think, you know, one of the earliest points we started out the discussions with was the topic of the definition of synthetic. You know, we were trying to figure out what does it actually mean. And I think, you know, as a panel, we came to the consensus that synthetic intelligence is some sort of physical construct where you are making something physical that exhibits properties of intelligence. So I think, to answer your question, that's how I think about it. Anyone, Anil or?
I mean, broadly, I think there is some of a consensus that AGI typically refers to, at the very minimum, an artificially intelligent system that has all the capabilities of human-level intelligence and perhaps more, because in that sense it's a chimera. As soon as an AI is as intelligent as a human, it's going to be more intelligent than humans in some ways, because it already is. So it's a high bar, whereas synthetic intelligence, I think, is much more generic. So anything that does the right thing at the right time or solves a problem in some flexible way, whether or not it's up to human standards, is an example of synthetic intelligence. That's how I would distinguish.
Yep, question?
Okay, so hi, my name is Sarah first. I'm from TKS, and I have two questions. One is really specific, and one is very broad. So first question is, how can we design synthetic intelligence to complement and expand human ingenuity rather than overshadow it in creative fields?
I was actually talking about this weirdly at a big marketing conference in Leipzig last week. So there's a lot of worry, especially in the creative industries, about how AI is stealing all the jobs. One of my former mentors, a philosopher called Daniel Dennett, I think, has this very nice way of thinking about it, which is that we should think of AI as a tool rather than a colleague, and always remember the difference. And part of that is not to diminish ourselves by assuming that things like language models have all the capabilities that we do. We don't. When it comes to creativity, there's sort of three things that are important. Something has to be new, surprising, and valuable. Now, AI can be very good at generating new things. It can occasionally be surprising, but whether it's valuable or not is still something that's pretty much in the human domain to evaluate. Creativity, innovation is very much in the eye of the beholder. So I would think about using AI as a sort of a generative tool for playing with ideas, but not for deciding which ideas are the good ideas.
And my next question, which is very broad, do you think AI could gain consciousness around this time? If so, how long till it gain consciousness?
So okay, I'm gonna say that with what we have now, we are not going to get conscious AI. The reason why I say this is because, the most common models that we have are large language models, right? And the output of a large language model is a vector that gets translated into a token which we recognize as a word. Now, Gen Zers, Gen Alphas are coming up with words that we have no clue, at least from the millennial and the Gen Xers and boomers, like skibbity, Riz, Alpha, and Sigma. What do all these things mean, right? But for the Gen Alphas and the Gen Zs who are using these words, it means something. It's a conscious experience. Now, if a machine has no way of actually dealing with this, can we then say that they have the full ability and conscious experience to actually recognize these tokens? But I've been told we are out of time, and thank you very much for coming to our fireside chat.
Thank you, Hon, and thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.